Every war has the story that makes the front page, and then it has the one running in the hills nobody bothers to explain. And this is the second kind. While the world kept its eyes on missile launches, airstrikes, and tanker seizures, there's been a real grinding fight happening the entire time along Iran's western frontier. One carried out by thousands of armed Kurdish fighters, split across several organized groups, and it may honestly be the single most persistent internal security headache Tehran has had to manage throughout this whole war. So let's actually sit with this one properly, from where it started decades back to what's happening on the ground right now. Picture the map first. Kurds make up somewhere around 1 in 10 Iranians, maybe closer to 1 in 8, clustered along the western border in a region people have called Iranian Kurdistan for generations. That's not a small minority tucked into a corner somewhere. It's a substantial population with its own language, its own culture, and a very long memory of organized armed resistance against the Islamic Republic. A memory that goes all the way back to the birth of that government itself. That starting point matters more than almost anything else in this story. When the revolution swept the Shah out of power in 1979, Kurdish leaders thought they finally saw an opening, a real shot at the autonomy that had been denied to them for as long as anyone could remember. The Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, led by Abdurrahman Qasemlu, teamed up with the leftist Kamala Party, mobilized Peshmerga fighters, and actually took control of large stretches of Iranian Kurdistan on the ground. Khomeini's government wasn't interested in negotiating autonomy at all. Jihad was declared against the Kurdish movement that same year, and what followed was ugly by any measure. Something like 10,000 people killed, including 1,200 Kurdish political prisoners executed outright by the state. Everything that has happened since traces back to that wound. To understand why Piranshahr mattered, you have to go back to where this population sits inside Iran in the first place. Kurds make up somewhere around 10 to 12% of the country's population, concentrated along the western border in the region long called Iranian Kurdistan, with their own language, their own culture, and a grievance against Tehran that predates the Islamic Republic's very first year in power. When the revolution toppled the Shah in 1979, Kurdish leaders thought they'd finally get the autonomy generations before them had been denied. The Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, led by Abdurrahman Qasemlu, and the leftist Kamala Party, mobilized Peshmerga units and took real control of large parts of Iranian Kurdistan. Khomeini's government answered by refusing to negotiate anything and declaring jihad against the Kurdish movement that same year. Roughly 10,000 people were killed in the crackdown that followed, including 1,200 Kurdish political prisoners executed outright. If you've ever watched a movement get crushed right at the moment it thought it had won, you know how that kind of memory doesn't fade, it just waits. So when the current war broke out at the end of February, Kurdish opposition groups weren't caught flat-footed. They'd essentially been rehearsing for this moment already, because Iran had been sliding through genuine political instability for months before the first missile ever flew. Major Kurdish parties had already thrown their weight behind general strikes during the wider Iranian protest wave of that period. Strikes the Kurdish population largely honored. And small-scale insurgent operations were already underway under a newly formed umbrella group calling itself the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. On day one of the war, coalition representatives went public, saying they were coordinating political and military decisions jointly and gearing up for what they called a new phase, with fighters they claimed were already positioned deep inside Iranian territory near the Iraq border, ready to move as things developed. That's a coordinated mobilization measured in hours, not weeks. So when this war began on the 28th of February 2026, Kurdish opposition wasn't improvising. Political instability inside Iran had already been building through late 2025. Major Kurdish parties had already called general strikes that were widely observed across Kurdish areas, and several factions had already united under a new umbrella group, the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. On the very first day of the war, that coalition said publicly it was coordinating political and military decisions jointly and claimed its fighters were already positioned inside Iranian territory along the border with Iraq, ready to move. Iran struck back fast. On the 2nd of March, the Kurdistan Freedom Party said 2 of its bases in Erbil had been hit directly, killing at least 1 fighter. 4 days later, Tehran threatened to strike every facility across Iraqi Kurdistan if Kurdish militants were allowed to cross in through that territory, leaving the Kurdistan regional government stuck between a threat from Iran it hadn't provoked and armed Kurdish factions it couldn't fully control inside its own borders. Then Washington entered the picture, and for a few weeks the entire tone of this shifted. The Wall Street Journal reported the United States was actively considering support for armed militias inside Iran. Asked directly about a Kurdish offensive, Trump said simply, "I'd be all for it." The Washington Post reported he'd offered American air cover and further backing to anti-regime Kurdish groups specifically to help them take territory in western Iran. And in private conversations, Kurdish leaders were reportedly told to choose a side, America and Israel or Iran. Imagine being handed that choice after 40 years of watching outside powers use your people and then walk away. Azizi confirmed Trump had spoken directly with Kurdistan Democratic Party leader Mustafa Hidri about possible involvement, though he said there was no immediate plan for a full ground offensive at that stage. Researcher Vladimir van Vilgenberg, who studies the region closely, argued Kurdish factions needed firm American guarantees before committing to anything larger. And one opposition figure put it about as bluntly as it can be put: "We can't move if the air above us isn't cleared." Kurdish leadership responded with more caution than you might expect, given the offer on the table. Khalid Azizi, a spokesperson for the Kurdistan Democratic Party, told an American television interviewer that Kurdish forces were watching everything closely, but weren't planning a full ground offensive at that moment, though he confirmed Trump had spoken directly with the party's own leader about possible involvement. Azizi's history here carries weight. He was in the room and wounded back in 2018 when those ballistic missiles hit party headquarters mid-meeting. He said the resistance was still strong after decades of confrontation with Tehran, but pushed Western governments to focus on helping Iranian opposition groups actually coordinate with each other, not just on the military side of things. It didn't survive. The moment passed. Through the spring, Kurdish groups held back, wary that Washington had no clear long-term objective and might abandon them mid-fight the way outside powers had before. And Turkey was leaning hard on the situation too, deeply uneasy about any stronger independent Kurdish military force taking shape near its own border, given its own long domestic conflict with Kurdish separatists. Iran used the pause to reinforce its border with Iraqi Kurdistan, pressure Baghdad to expel Kurdish opposition groups, and revive the Muslim Peshmerga, a pro-Iranian Kurdish militia built specifically to counter the independent factions. Strikes on Kurdish camps in Iraq never really stopped. In March, an Iranian ballistic missile barrage hit a divisional headquarters in Soran district in Erbil province, killing 6 Peshmerga fighters and wounding around 30 more, which the Kurdistan region's Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs called a hostile and treacherous act. By mid-April, Rudor counted 16 separate strikes on Iraqi Kurdistan since the broader ceasefire had supposedly taken hold elsewhere. Which brings the story back to where it started, because that ceasefire is exactly why Piranshahr happened when it did, rather than back in March when American backing seemed loudest. The Islamabad memorandum in mid-June paused the main fighting between the United States, Israel and Iran, but it never touched Iran's campaign against the Kurds. The strikes on Iraqi Kurdistan kept coming right through it. With the world's attention drifting elsewhere and Iran still treating Kurdish opposition as a live threat regardless of any formal truce, Kurdish factions appear to have judged this the moment to press, even without the dramatic air cover Trump had floated months earlier. Real fighting broke out in early June between the Kurdistan Free Life Party and the Revolutionary Guards in the highlands around Marivan and south of Mahabad, then spread through late June and into July across the Iran-Iraq border zone, the Sardasht-Baneh Sakez Triangle, and multiple towns, pulling in the Kurdistan Democratic Party alongside them. Iran wasn't standing still through any of this either. Border regions along Iraqi Kurdistan were reinforced. Baghdad was pressured to push Kurdish opposition groups off Iraqi soil, and Iran reactivated elements of what's known as the Muslim Peshmerga, a pro-Iranian Kurdish militia built specifically to counter the independent anti-regime Kurdish factions in the same territory. Strikes on Kurdish camps inside Iraq kept coming at a brutal clip. One missile barrage in March killed 6 Peshmerga fighters and wounded around 30 more in Erbil province, hitting a divisional headquarters directly in the Soran district. The regional Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs called it a hostile and treacherous act that violated basic norms of neighborly relations. By mid-April, one regional outlet was reporting 16 separate strikes on Iraqi Kurdistan since the supposed broader ceasefire had taken hold, which tells you plainly how little that ceasefire actually meant for Kurdish areas, even while the main fighting elsewhere had paused. And that's the state of things right now, sitting exactly where Majid Ghalai described it. Heavier than routine border friction, short of a full uprising, but real enough that Iran has had to keep pouring missiles, border reinforcements, and loyalist militias into holding a front most of the world stopped watching once the ceasefire headlines came out. 6 named fighters near Piranshahr, thousands more still positioned across the western mountains, and a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Whether Washington's flirtation with backing them back in March was ever a real offer worth trusting, or whether Kurdish leaders were right to hold back and wait for a war that so far still hasn't fully arrived. Where you land on that probably says something about how much faith you'd put in a promise like that yourself.